I'm honored to introduce Dr. Molly Gibson. And Molly is the co-founder and chief strategy and innovation officer at Generate Biomedicines, a therapeutics company existing at the intersection of biology, machine learning, and biological engineering. She is also origination partner at Flagship Pioneering, which we're going to talk about all of this while Emily does some designing. Thank you very much, Molly, for joining us. How you doing?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
Cool. So our fireside, the title is The Age of New Medicines, How AI is Empowering and Disrupting the Discovery of Proteins, Biologics, Therapeutics, and Materials. And you're much more of an expert than I am, but we're going to have a fun conversation. Like our other fireside chats, we do a little bit of kind of the past and present and then future. And so, the early days of your career when we chatted on the phone and we also did that pre-interview, which was great. You started as a computer scientist in software engineering at Boeing and
Yep.
built flight simulators for the F-15. I mean, why, how'd you go from that to biology? And what did you love about that? But why did you loving biology more?
So this is an interesting path, and I think it is a theme throughout my career. It's really been kind of doing the most interesting thing at any moment in time. And so in undergrad, I was not one of the people that went into school like, I know exactly what I want to do. I'm going to be a dentist, or I'm going to be a doctor, or I have a defined career path. I was just exploring and just constantly kind of trying to figure out what I wanted to do. So I took a lot of different classes. I took biology classes, but I fell in love with computer science, and just this idea that you could, teach a computer to think. We'll get into the actual teaching to think like in the generative AI sense, but this was just logic, just, being able to program even just for loops and if statements and just that type of logic. And so I fell in love with computer science and programming and software engineering. So did my degree in that. But along the way, I had taken a lot of classes. It was at a liberal arts school in biology and science and other things. After my degree, I got approached by Boeing for a role there, and it just seemed interesting. So at the moment, like being able to apply what I had learned to something that was, important in the world, and in some instances could feel like you were, playing a game every day when you went to work. But as I started in the job, I realized that it wasn't actually fulfilling some of the things that I wanted the most in my career. And parts of that are one, applying my expertise or applying my skills to solving the most important problems that humans face today. And two, the creativity around how do computers solve challenges that aren't straightforward, that aren't really physics problems or engineering problems. And so that's what drew me to biology, was thinking biology is complicated. There's no equations that describe it. How do we actually use computers to solve things in life sciences? And so that was kind of why I started there and why I quickly pivoted away.
Cool. And so give the audience a couple of examples of your research. What were the topic or two of the research when you're doing your PhD to give context? Because there's many PhDs in our audience. Sometimes they're thinking about commercializing. Sometimes they want a career in research and science, which is great, or a combination. And you kind of seem to be over time found a combination in both. So
Yeah.
maybe just a little bit of context to how you made the decisions, not just what you did.
Yeah. So when I started my PhD, I actually never thought I would be an academic. It wasn't thinking I'm going to go into academia. And so I wasn't setting myself up for what's the best postdoc, what's the best
Right.
academic position. I was setting myself up to have, built the skill set that would be required to make impact. And I don't even think I knew what an entrepreneur was at the time, to be honest. I just had this intuition that I wanted to build things. I wanted to build companies. And I didn't have words for it.
Did you
And
see other people building things? Or I mean, how did you
no,
just from tinkering and it just happened?
I just,
Cool.
it just seemed cool. So I grew up in central Iowa, on really in a remote area, farms pretty much everywhere. It does not look like where I live now today in Boston. And so it wasn't surrounded that way. WashU in St. Louis is a wonderful school, is where I did my PhD, and I can tell a little bit about that. wonderful school, amazing people, and it's the reason that I went there. But I wouldn't say that they, drove an entrepreneurial culture. And I think, now my comparisons are places like MIT. So it's a little bit of an unfair comparison. But it was just, I didn't see that. I remember having a conversation towards the end of my PhD with a professor, and describing what I wanted to do. And they like kind of looked at me with this like blank stare, like, how are you going to do that? And I really didn't know how I was going to do that. But I knew that I had to, get into the ecosystem. And so that's truly what I did. So just to back up to go to where you were starting, which was my PhD and, what I did. I really was looking for two things. One is I wanted to join a lab where the PI was supportive and drove growth in me as an individual. And so people were really important to me. That was like probably my number one decision. And any grad student that I ever talked to, that was the top advice. I would pick people over content, people over
Sure.
topic every day of the week. And then the second was I wanted to work on problems that wouldn't be able to be solved without a computer. So it wasn't something that you could just do another way and I have a better way. I wanted to solve problems that you only could do this way or essentially could only do this way. And so that's why I started focusing on what is the microbiome. And so it's essentially all of the bacteria that live inside of us, on our skin, in our environment, on every surface around us. There are these, small communities of organisms that live everywhere. And they affect our environment, they affect our health, they affect disease. I know that people have gotten very familiar with viruses from the pandemic, but this is something that are living inside of us. Our gut is full of bacteria, and the bacteria do really important things. They break down our foods. They regulate our immune system. They regulate our immune response. They're constantly sensing things for us. But in order to understand these like communities, you actually have to have computers because they're incredibly complex, and they're constantly dynamic. And so you have to be able to analyze them with data, and large data. And so that's what I focused on. And at the time, I didn't really know if that was even commercializable, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
and what was like back then when you were doing
yeah.
that? What was the definition of large data then and large data now as a
Oh,
context? Because
yeah.
some people might not. I mean, like it's got to be exponentially different.
Oh, it's totally different. I mean, this was really kind of at the beginning of even next generation sequencing. And
Right.
so, we were going from, I don't, if people are familiar with sequencing technologies like, 454 sequencing to, what the Illumina technology looks like today, in NGS. And so the scale of data, even in sequencing, was changing throughout the time I was even in my PhD.
Sure.
And today, like when people think about large data today, they're actually talking about all of the internet.
Exactly. I mean,
So
it's like when
like,
I started with a digital camera. My first digital camera, I think, was a 200K image, and now
yeah,
and the camera was that big, and my smartphone now, has a 20 or 30 megabyte photo or more,
yeah.
and it's exponential.
Yeah, it's completely different. And so we were talking about, I mean, we're talking about my like small amounts of data, but I would say when I was thinking about large data then, it was something you couldn't analyze in Excel.
Right. Got it.
So that was kind of the distinction at that time in which you needed a computer to process the data.
Right.
And I mean, this was orders of magnitude beyond what you could process in
Sure.
Excel, but still not anywhere close to what we think about in the like foundation model world today. In definitely not in general AI, but also in like foundation models in biology that you're starting to see. So, so yeah, that was kind of the PhD and what I focused on.
And then
But
you
that's
jump
actually,
to Flagship Pioneering, who founded,
yep.
they founded Moderna, which now everybody knows. And several years ago, prior to the pandemic, less people probably knew. And
Yeah.
so, how did you choose them? And tell us about your role there, which led
Yeah.
to leading to creating businesses, which is so exciting.
Yeah, so I joined actually not Flagship initially. I joined one of the companies that they spun out. So
Okay,
let me just describe Flagship a little bit. So Flagship is a venture capital firm. We look like a venture capital firm, I should say. We have funds like a venture capital firm would, but the operations of the organization look dramatically different. We don't invest in external ventures. We actually have internal entrepreneurs who are building and growing companies that our fund invests in, and we have all the support systems to do that. So, we have over 300 people, which is not a traditional VC structure, as you
so
know.
it's more of a studio structure, but for focused in life sciences and
Exactly.
biotech and materials
Yeah.
and also it takes much longer. And that the benefit, one of the benefits, obviously, is it takes much longer probably to create advancements in tech in that versus a software business that doesn't relate to life sciences.
Much more time and much more capital.
Yeah, right.
And I think those two things, and it requires a unique perspective on value creation. I think that's one of the things that Flagship and the organization institution has done well is figure out how do you create value from the types of innovations you can have in biotech. And those aren't just drugs, they're also platforms. And how do you create drugs off of platforms? So I didn't start there, but it spins out companies. It starts companies. And when I was done with my PhD around 2015, I had done all my research in the microbiome space. And this was about when we were starting to understand the benefit of fecal microbiome transplants
Mm-hmm.
for C. diff. So, this is a incredibly difficult bacterial infection of the gut that causes immense pain in patients, and is constantly recurring. So even when it's treated, it comes back. And so when it comes back, what they realize is that oftentimes we try to treat the organ by sometimes just antibiotics. But what people are realizing is that when it's really diseased, and you think about the gut microbiome as an organ in this context, when it's really diseased, you actually just have to replace it. So people would start to replace it with someone else's. And that was done through transferring feces from one human to the other human in their gut. And so the look on your face is exactly how most people felt about this, but they do it because, it was important to their health, and to their well-being. But Flagship was working on companies like Tessera Therapeutics, which is one of the companies I got connected with, who has an approved drug in this space to create these types of treatments that didn't have to be sourced from feces of others, but could actually be grown and incubated in the lab, which made it a much more obviously reproducible and systematic therapeutic. And so they were doing that type of research in the microbiome space, but they're also starting to think about what are other innovations that we could do in the microbiome space. And that's where I got connected with Kaleido Biosciences. And it was thinking about how do we use fiber or novel glycans that we can synthesize to, instead of, like I said, with the fecal transplant, actually wiping out the gut and replacing it, how do
Sure.
you modulate it with things that you might see every day in your everyday life, like fiber?
I mean, it sounds like it's so obvious. It makes sense now, but years ago, without computers, this wasn't possible, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it was one of those things where what I found interesting about it is that there's so much research out there for diabetes, for obesity, for all types of metabolic disease that if people with high fiber diets did better. But we don't have there was no control on the actual molecule of what fiber it was. It could be many different types of molecules. There's just no real understanding of
Right.
the science behind it and the connection between the actual drug, in this case, fiber, to what was happening. And so this was actually Kaleido's hypothesis, was that you could just like any kind of small molecule where you're doing this structure guided design of a molecule in response to how it affects human biology, could you do that with glycans or fibers? And so that's what we were doing at Kaleido, um, which was, really different and interesting, and it was a fun place to start. But it just got me really connected into the ecosystem. So I learned what Flagship was. I learned entrepreneurship.
More about the entrepreneur, about everything. And that was quite
Yeah.
a roller coaster. So, I mean, it's very exciting, went public, and then unfortunately closed down in 2022. So, I mean, what happened in your mind, and what was your biggest learning that maybe others, I think, our biggest learnings from mistakes frequently help ourselves and others. So, I
Yeah.
mean, what was your biggest learning that you don't want to do again, and how can that help others?
Yeah, definitely. So when I look back, so was a scientist at Kaleido, and so I wasn't close to all the decisions that were made, in the
Sure.
end in that moment, but I was close to the science underneath it. And I'll say what I learned the most was the importance of being able to like truly connect the underlying mechanism of a drug to its outcome and to its
and
impact.
to us and to an impact, yeah, right,
And to
which
an
is
impact.
similar to what we were talking about earlier with Esther Dyson. And it's not just, it's, many businesses can be created, but if you don't solve a specific big problem,
Exactly.
leapfrog from others, it's not valuable, and usually ends with
Yeah.
a challenging demise.
I mean, it has to be an important problem with an important impact and be, measurable and differentiated. And this is why all of my future work has been focused on places where we have true underlying mechanism associated with what we're treating, and we can connect those to large and impactful problems in the world, in ways that, maybe we haven't been able to do with other fields.
Was there a bit of I mean, so it's interesting sometimes when I look back, I felt like we at different startups I was building before being an investor. I was an entrepreneur for 18 years, and sometimes I felt like, wow, this is a huge problem. We got to solve it. But years later, I realized, well, that was interesting, but it wasn't really a morphine problem. It was a vitamin or an aspirin, or important,
Mhm.
but not,
Yeah.
huge. I mean, had there been a transition of your learning similarly, or so how do you know it's big enough problem, or
Yeah, I think
there's a real enough solution?
this is where discipline and entrepreneurship is important.
Mm-hmm.
Because oftentimes what I mean, entrepreneurs are like by nature like creative, driven people and want to solve problems. And so we get intrigued and like I mean, people call it the shiny ball object, right? Like by the new thing that you can solve. And one of the challenges is that the like new shiny thing might not always be the most important thing for you to be working on. And while you can make a case for it, like I mean, I can make a case for lots of technology and the need for them. The question is, it's always a question of opportunity cost in my mind.
Right.
It's always a question of if you did that, what are you not going to do?
Mm-hmm.
And so like you have to, and even when I was starting to think about what I wanted my first company that I founded to look like, I had many ideas, some of which I had pitched internally, and I'm pretty sure if I would have pushed, I could have gotten funded. But I sat there, after pitching on one of them, where I was like, all right, I think I can get this funded. I think they'll support me in this. Do I want to spend the next 5 years of my life solving this problem?
And five is actually, sometimes it's up to 10 and 12.
Yeah, exactly. And I couldn't get myself to give myself like that full body yes of like, oh
Sure.
yes, I am excited. I want to solve this problem. In 5 years, I would be happy if I was still working on it. And so I passed up on that idea and I kept looking. And that's where I found Generate
That's
Biomedicines.
when you started Generate
Yeah.
Biomedicines. Yeah. So just for context for the audience, what's great is there's a lot of synergies here. Even though other markets, LDV has been investing in generative AI since 2018. Before that term existed, we've got 9 companies, and you co-founded Generate Biomedicines in 2018, leveraging generative AI for drug discovery and development in the same year. Before that term existed, I mean, there was GANs and other technical terms that different industries used. So tell us about Generate Biomedicines. And what was your vision for that one, and what's being done now?
Yeah. So when we first looked at started working on this, like you said, it was before generative AI existed. And honestly, when I was talking to some very respected machine learning scientists, it was before like many people actually believed generative like AI would be a thing. And I think this was partially because of how challenging GANs in themselves were to get to work and things like that, but other reasons as well. And so what really started here was there was a problem that a colleague was working on, and they were talking about how hard it was to engineer a protein. I didn't know anything about proteins. Like I barely understood what a protein structure was. But they kept telling me like, if only I could get this protein that does this to do this. And I started like asking them about the problem, and trying to understand, well, what even evidence do you have that it can do that, that it would ever be able to do that? And they're, well, like there's this thing called directed evolution. If I modulate the DNA, I can push it in this direction, but I don't understand why it happens. Evolution just does it, and it takes like 5 postdocs to be able to get there. And I was like, all right, that sounds painful. But what it told me is there was an underlying relationship between modulating the piece of DNA that encodes the protein and the function of the protein. And if you understood that relationship, you could skip the 4 years of postdoc and then directed evolution and just have a machine tell you what's the piece of DNA you need to synthesize that will give you the function of the protein you want. And so that was kind of the underlying insight that led to us really starting to explore the idea that you could do what we were calling actually generative biology, that you could generate a piece of DNA sequence that would give you encode for any kind of protein that you wanted for any kind of function. And we started showing just examples of this. We actually, our first experiment that we did was on GFP. We showed that we could, by learning on all of the GFP sequences that exist today, we could generate, just using machine learning, no protein structures, no previous information. We could generate GFPs that were 50 times brighter than anything that had been seen before. And that was a toy problem, but it was the first example that we were able to show that machine learning could engineer a protein.
Wow. So, but just for context for the audience, so at that stage, I mean, it reminds me sometimes, I mean, there must have been a group of people, or tell me, were there a group of people that were like, oh my God, definitely, you should definitely do that. I believe in it's going to happen. Or what percent? Okay. And then what percent were like, we believe it? And what percent says that's impossible? And there might be a different group, right? Within Flagship, there might be more. I mean, well, tell me, is there a different, personality trait in that group? Because you're building business all the time versus maybe you have friends in the PhD and other parts of in your life that are saying, Molly, what are you crazy? Why are you wasting your time with that? It's never going to work. So what was the balance, and how did you fight that or go against it?
Yeah, so I would say there were a few labs that were starting to kind of see signs of this throughout academic circles. And there were then major protein engineering labs that were still in the biophysics realms, and still believed that biophysics was going to be the way and that was going to be how it happened. And then when you move to industry, most of industry did not believe this was going to happen when we started. I remember having a conversation with, I won't name the company, but I remember just wanting to strike a partnership with them, like, can we have just a little bit of data, and then you can have rights to a lot of downstream potential opportunity. And they looked at us like, I mean, like literally laughed me out of the room. And I was like,
yeah, it reminds me, I had a meeting at Kodak in 1997, trying to get them to partner with us to build an internet imaging, a broadband photo sharing website. And they said, why do we need an internet imaging strategy? And obviously, the rest is history.
Exactly.
It's amazingly challenging. I mean, that's how leapfrog businesses are created.
Yeah, for sure. And within Flagship, I think there was both a in like a we always take leaps, right? We're always like thinking about the things that could be. And so we're oftentimes taught to like suspend disbelief in these moments. And so, while everyone was suspending disbelief, I think there was also still this like kind of undertone of, okay, but we've been doing it this way for so long. So it was interesting to build in that
Sure.
context. And it was a fun place to do it. I don't think there would have been any place that would have allowed us to build as big a vision as we did around it. And it was really big. It was a big vision. And it's been
That's
fun.
cool. Yeah, well, that's one of the things we love. I mean, we invest, as you know, but for to remind more of the audience, we invest pre-revenue, pre-product, and about 30% of the time we give a term sheet pre-incorporation. And your point about when people tell us, "Hey, it's going to be different. We're going to do it a different way in the future," and we do due diligence and reference on that opportunity with the
Yeah.
legacy companies, and they say, "No, you're crazy. It's never going to work. It's physically, technically impossible." And actually, I was uncomfortable for our first 5 years of investing with that. But
Hmm.
now we only invest when we hear that typically. And when they say
Yeah.
it makes sense, I get worried we're too late.
Yeah.
And so it sounds very similar. Let's jump to another topic, which we were fortunate enough to have you give a quote in a recent article, speaking about interest in creation of next generation materials with
Yep.
AI. Can you give the audience a couple of examples of what your or spaces or sectors you're excited about, and why now from biology to biology and materials?
Yeah, so this goes back to a couple different themes that we talked about so far.
Yeah.
One was that I think we should be focused on what are the most important problems that solve in the world. And I can't think of a bigger problem than climate change as a sustainability to
Hmm.
not just like the future health of our planet, but honestly, the future health of people.
Hmm.
And so this all kind of started from that of, what can we do to make an impact there? And I started looking at it from a biology lens, because, that's what Flagship does primarily, is how do you use biology to change the world? And every time I looked at it, I recognized that we're already doing many of the things that we can do in agriculture, which is the biggest area that affects climate change. I think you see this thing, see Indigo, Inari, some of those kinds of companies that we founded. They're already solving some of the big climate change challenges using agriculture as a muse. And outside of that, I kept thinking that this is an important problem, but is biology the right tool? Is biology the right
Okay.
hammer?
Sure.
And I kept coming to the answer that for like things like carbon capture, again, outside of agriculture, I don't know that biology is the right tool.
Got it.
Or for us to build better batteries or battery storage or get to a green hydrogen economy or whatever it is that we think is going to be the solutions to the problems we face. And I realized that inorganic materials are, and that the types of transformations we've seen in the protein space and in biology with generative AI don't exist. And the connections between labs and experimental labs and AI scientists don't exist. They don't talk. And so my question was, could we take some of the lessons we've learned from building Generate, some of the types of technologies we've built from building Generate, and build a similar type of organization and company for materials? Could you do generative AI for materials and integrate data and computation in such a way that you can develop differentiated products? And so that was really the origin of why we started diving into materials.
Cool. And is there? It seems like it's still early days in this next initiative, so we'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
Let's talk about kind of the next iteration, which I love, which is um, how will AI impact the historic scientific method, which
Yep.
you and I talked about, and I love this. So I'll let you explain, you know,
Yeah.
concisely better than I, kind of the then and the future, or
Yeah.
the past and the future of that.
So, I mean, if we think about how science looks today, the scientific method has been around for centuries, really. But it's this idea that we generate hypotheses, we go out in the world, we test those hypotheses, and then we update our mental model. of how the world works. And this is something that happens incredibly distributed within individual scientists' brains. And the only way that we communicate those, updates to our mental model is through scientific publication, conferences, talks like this, whatever it is. That's our method for updating this distributed network of science within all of our brains. And so the question really is there a way in which we can do this different? Is there a way in which AI can actually come up with new scientific hypotheses and beyond that, go into the lab and test those hypotheses? And so that's really what we're thinking about is how do you think about transforming generative experimentation and the scientific method in a way that allows you to create a centralized mental model of science in ways that aren't possible today.
And so it also relates to, I'm sure you in your industry and many of the kind of tech world, it's all about the papers that are constant, that are now being published so quickly and so rapidly with so many variations. It's even hard to keep up to date on everything. It seems like that should all be replaced. The question is, does that then commoditize or democratize in a positive way or commoditize in a negative way the creation of science? I mean, I get asked this all the time, as far as AI, there's a lot of things I don't want to do that I'd love AI to help me do 80% of my day so I can focus the 20% on the strategy, the creativity, and the human part. But is that similar in your field, do you believe?
Yeah, I completely agree with this. Like, I think this is something I've been spending a lot of time honestly thinking about this in the last year or so of what is the world going to look like when AI is as powerful as people are predicting it will be.
Yeah.
And I think it's not a world where we aren't going to have creative things for humans to do. Like, I think we're always going to have creative things for humans to do. And we're just going to change it. I have a prediction that everybody has no idea how many mundane things that we do on a daily basis, that if you weren't doing those things, you would be so much better at the things that you're uniquely capable of doing. And there's never going to be a world, or I don't predict there's a world in which AI does all of the things that we are going to do. Just because the limitations with resources,
Sure.
the limitations with just access. There's going to be a human component to the future of science. There's going to be human components to the future of
Sure.
our society.
But what's interesting, people get worried. Some people, I don't, but people worry about, hey, it's going to replace us. It's not going to replace us. But there's a lot of things I'd like it to replace.
Totally.
In your work, what are a couple of things that you like, the bane of my existence? I don't want to do that anymore. I want AI to do it. What would that be?
I mean, there's so many things. Like, I'm gonna go toward recency biases because this is, what I was doing today.
Sure. Sure.
Like, I was reviewing for a large contract for one of our organizations. Like reading the MSA and the statement of work and making sure that everything made sense. And I'm like, why am I doing this? Why can't I just like upload this? And I ended up doing that. Upload this to ChatGPT and just have it like answer all my questions. I don't have to find it. And it actually, worked to a certain degree. I think it could be better. But
So the question there, as we were talking with Esther earlier about the kind of, asking the right questions, trusting the answers. So the question is, you probably have to validate the answers still, but it might help the process of it.
It helps the process. But that was recency bias. But I'd say like the things that I hope it will be able to do is to even tell me what the next experiment is that I might be able to do, to test my hypotheses. Or, scientists are constantly optimizing protocols. And this is something that like has oftentimes have hundreds of parameters that you don't even know that you're making these decisions. But if a computer understood all those parameters, they could make decisions in ways that humans can't. So I think those are the types of things that we'll see happen.
Okay, cool. Well, we've got about a minute and a half left, and so I got a couple short last questions that I enjoy ending on. So, in one word answers.
All right.
What's the best and least best personality trait of an entrepreneur?
So the best is growth mindset.
Okay.
Worst, political.
Political. Okay. Now, since you got, a career background in PhD, talking about PhDs, what
Yeah.
is the best and least best about PhDs?
Um, I'd say I'm going to go a little bit similar here, but creativity
Okay.
um, is best, and worst is linear.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And so on the last question is, so what visual technologies are you most excited about in the next 20 years that, either relate to your work and your career or in general as a human?
So I think AI having the potential to see is going to be the unlock in order to allow AI to go from the bits in our computer to the physical world. And so while I'm super interested in all of the kind of structural graph neural network technologies that are going to exist for science, I
Right.
think that's well proven today. What I don't think is proven yet is how computer seeing is going to change our physical world.
I love it. I didn't even give those words to you, but it validates our thesis and our whole day, and hopefully more opportunities to collaborate in the future. I can't wait for
Yeah,
that vision to come through.
definitely.
Molly, thank you very much. Fantastic to have you today and share your wisdom with our audience.
Thank you so much for having me. This was fun.